Hello everybody from spring-like London. My name is Gillian Perry, and for some 26 years I was the executive director as well as the co-founder of the Anne Frank Trust in the UK, the partner organisation of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. Now, many of you may have visited Amsterdam, perhaps on a beautiful Viking ship or riverboat. But many of you, I hope, after this lecture, will be planning a visit to this really unique and beautiful city. What I'm going to do, because I'm a sort of quite an expert after 26 years on the life and times of Anne Frank, I'm going to show you this amazing city, once visited, never forgotten, through the eyes of Anne. And much of the city remains exactly as she would have seen it. Now, on some of the slides of the locations I'm going to take you to this evening, you will see the addresses, and if you want to make a note of those addresses for when you visit the city, that might be quite useful. Of course, some of the ships come into Amsterdam, the ocean ships come into Amsterdam or leave from Amsterdam, and you might want to extend your stay, but certainly I know that a lot of the beautiful river cruises leave from Amsterdam. So really worthwhile if you can get a couple of extra days in Amsterdam, or even explore the countryside around the Netherlands. It's really beautiful. And something I must mention about Amsterdam, I've been working in the city for nearly 30 years now with my colleagues at the Anne Frank House. And when you walk around the city, virtually everybody, apart from foreign tourists, will speak English. So that's really useful. I'm going to take you first to my first slide, and this is where our story is centered upon. And this is the building on the Prinsengracht. Prinsengracht means Prince's Canal, Gracht means canal. Many of the main thoroughfares of the city, the names end in Gracht, which means canal. So this is the Canal of Princes, and this is where our story is focused, because this is the location of the Anne Frank House. It's very modern looking, part of it, which was rebuilt and refurbished in 1999. You can see many crowds standing in line very patiently to get into the Anne Frank House. Now, of course, for obvious reasons, you're not going to see those lines of people, at least for the foreseeable future, if you go and visit the Anne Frank House, because even when lockdown is completely finished, there's going to be a lot of socially distancing rules in place. But in actual fact, a few years ago, the Anne Frank House changed the way that you book your tickets. So please be aware of that. If you are going to visit the Anne Frank House, you must try and book your tickets online on their website about 6 weeks before your visit, and then you should get tickets. If you plan it, if you try and book too early, the tickets won't be released yet. If you leave it too late, too near your visit, you will be disappointed. And I know that when I've been lecturing on Viking ships, people come up to me all the time and say, Gillian, please, can you help us get tickets for the Anne Frank House? And I say, I'm so sorry, maybe next time, but book your tickets online. The adult ticket price is €10. Maybe it will go up slightly in view of the museum has been closed for so much of the last year through COVID. If you have difficulty with steps, it's not a good idea to visit, because like a typical Dutch merchant house of the 17th century, the steps are very steep and narrow. And they're quite difficult to maneuver. And of course, there is no real disabled access within the house. And what you will see is actually empty rooms when you walk around the Anne Frank house, because it was Otto Frank's express wish that the furniture be removed. Well, of course, the furniture that the Frank family had there was removed after the family were arrested and given out to Nazi sympathising Dutch families. But Otto Frank specifically didn't want it to be refurnished when it opened as a museum, because he wanted that feeling of what was lost, what was actually lost on the 7 people who hid in the house and were murdered. So my story also centres around this man, as well as around Anne Frank. And this is Anne's father, Otto Frank. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of insight into how the Frank family arrived in Amsterdam in 1933. Because in fact, they were a German family. Otto Frank was born in 1889, in fact, the same year as Adolf Hitler, to a quite prosperous German Jewish family who had come out of the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto about 100 years earlier. And by the time Otto and his two brothers and sister were born in the late 19th century, Otto's father, Michael Frank, was so acculturalized and assimilated into Frankfurt society that he didn't just work in a bank, he actually owned a bank, the Michael Frank Investment Bank. Now, when he was a young man, Otto went off to study economics at Heidelberg University in Germany. And in 1908, he met and befriended a young American man called Nathan Strauss Jr. And Nathan invited his new friend Otto to come and do some work experience at his father's department store in the buzz of New York. And I think you can probably see from the photograph, which, by the way, I took myself because I work a lot in New York, of Macy's. Nathan Strauss's father owned Macy's. And so there was Otto as a young man, dashing young man in the early years of the 20th century, walking in through this very doorway into Macy's department store to do work experience. I took this photograph myself and I stand across the road when I'm there and I look at that doorway and think that's exactly where Otto would have gone in to do his work experience. Now, Otto loved New York. He loved the brashness and the newness and the get up and go compared to quite traditional Frankfurt in Europe. Probably he would have stayed in America and possibly become an American citizen, had not it been that in 1909, his father, Michael Frank, died very suddenly, and Otto was recalled to Europe to take over the running of the family bank. Otto wasn't a natural banker, he was more a successful small businessman, but nonetheless he felt the responsibility to do so. Now, in 1914, his life changed quite dramatically because he was called up to serve for his country, Germany, in the First World War. Now, Otto was in fact a very patriotic German. Germany had been very good to his family. And he fought so valiantly that by the end of the First World War, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for valour and been promoted to the rank of lieutenant, which of course didn't help him and his family some 20 years later. After the war, the Frank family lost a lot of their money through the terrible economic situation in Germany. Nonetheless, they retained a very high esteem by German society. In fact, Otto's father was a banker to the Kaiser. So they were a very highly regarded family. And in 1925, Otto married the daughter of a wealthy German industrialist from Aachen. Her name was Edith Hollander. And as you can probably guess from the name, there were roots in the Netherlands, in Holland, the neighbouring country. They had a beautiful society wedding, and then they went off to San Remo in Italy for their honeymoon. Now, the next year, in February 1926, their first daughter, Margot, was born. Beautiful little dark-eyed, dark-haired little girl. And 3 years later, their second daughter, Anneliese Marie, was born on June the 12th, 1929. Her name is soon shortened to Anne, pronounced in the continental way as Anna. I find this picture on the right very poignant of little Anna sleeping in her cot, probably aged about 3 years old, completely oblivious and innocent to what the world has in store for her. Now, this photograph was taken in March 1933, and there's Edith with her two adored daughters, Margot on the right and Anne on the left, on a family outing into Frankfurt. You can see that Margot is staring quite stoically at the camera, but little Anne already displaying some forceful personality. She's glowering at the camera. Probably her father had taken too many photos that day. But in actual fact, their life had changed by the time this photo was taken. As a German Jewish family, they were already under threat, because on January the 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. And in the beginning of March, just before this photograph was taken, the Nazi Party become the ruling party of Germany after the election. And pretty soon after that election, they start dismantling all forms of democracy by bringing in the Enabling Act, and those who protest against the new regime are thrown into labour camps, prison camps. Things soon start getting very difficult for Germany's Jewish population. Measures against the Jews to isolate them from society start being brought in. And even by that summer of 1933, Otto Frank, whose family had lived so successfully in Germany for so many generations, realizes there's no future for his family in the country of his birth. But where to go? Well, the neighbouring country of the Netherlands historically had been very tolerant of Jews and even Catholics, which was very unusual. Also, of course, in the First World War, the Netherlands had been neutral. And I guess more pragmatically, and from a business sense, Otto knew the city quite well because he'd done business there. But also his brother-in-law, who lived in Switzerland, actually worked for a German company called Opekta. And Opekta manufactured a product called pectin. Now, when I give this talk to youngsters in school, in high schools, and I ask them, do they know what pectin is? They look at me sort of blankly or sort of shake their heads vigorously. But when I give it to an older demographic and I ask what pectin is, they tend to know what it is. Pectin is a natural setting agent for making jelly and preserves. This was a very popular thing in 1930s Europe, and I'm sure perhaps in America too, where people used to pick their fruits seasonally and bottle it and preserve it for the winter. Nowadays, of course, we just go to the local Walmart or wherever and buy our preserves and jellies there. But this was a real business opportunity for Otto. So by the fall of that year, he has moved to Amsterdam. He's found an office on the Single Canal, and he opens a branch of the company Opekta to manufacture pectin. A little bit later on, he's joined by a business associate, another German Jewish refugee called Herman van Pels, and together they start importing spices to flavour sausages, which is another very popular commodity in the Netherlands at that time. This is a painting of the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam in the 17th century. And the Jews really started arriving in Amsterdam after the expulsion in the 16th and 17th century, 15th and 16th centuries from Spain and Portugal. And a lot of them found their way to Amsterdam. It was welcoming and tolerant. And it was the Jewish community in Amsterdam that really helped build the city as the famous merchant city that it became in the 17th century. And this was actually the Jewish quarter at that time. Now, Otto goes on ahead and he finds an apartment in a development called the Merwedeplein. The Merwedeplein is in the south of the city, and it's very, at the time, in the early 1930s, a very modern looking apartment building. Development, and probably what might have attracted Otto to this development was probably the nearest thing to a New York skyscraper that he could see in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is not known for its tall buildings. The development was built around a lovely triangular green grassy area where the adults used to meet and congregate and the children used to play together. The statue of Anne, of course, wasn't put up at the time. She wasn't known, but it was put up fairly recently by the owner of the local bookstore just around the corner. More about that bookstore a little bit later on. By December of that year, Edith and Margot, the older daughter, have come to join him. And then a couple of months later, in February 1934, Anne is brought to Amsterdam, brought by her grandmother. So if you want to visit this area, and it's very interesting if you've got a bit of time to spare and you're interested in Anne's life, you can take a tram from the central station very near to where the ships dock, and you can take a tram and ask for the tram that will take you to Valstraat. You might want to make a note of that, and walk a few hundred yards to the Mavedaplein. There's a plaque on the wall where the Franks lived. As you can see, Anne loved playing in the street around the development and soon started to make lots of friends. The dark coloured dress is worn by her friend Susanna Lederman. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the photo, you can see the shadow of the photographer who happens to be Anne's father, Otto Frank. Now, people have said to me in the past, there are so many beautiful photographs of Anne and Margot growing up. Really unusual collection of photographs. Well, the fact was that Otto bought himself a Leica camera, a beautiful camera, in the 1920s, and was a very keen amateur photographer. So his twin passions became photography and his two lovely daughters. And many of those photographs of the girls have the shadow of Mr. Frank taking the photograph. This is actually the inside of the apartment, number 37 Mavedaplein. It's been furnished by the Anne Frank house, furnished in the style of the furniture that the Frank family would have had in the apartment. It's owned by the Anne Frank house. They bought it in 2017. And they rent it out every 6 months to a writer who is in exile in the Netherlands, having fled their nation, which makes sense because, of course, the Frank family were refugees from Germany. Now, Anne started school at age 4 at the school just around the corner. And it was the Montessori school. There's the address there if you want to visit the school where Anne started her education. Montessori education was very popular with the German Jewish refugees. They liked the balance of a formal education, but with creativity and informality when needed. So if you look at the left-hand picture, you can see Anne at the back, on the right on the back, with her teacher, Miss Bodron. And in the right-hand picture, you can see Anne's classroom. And if you look carefully, you can see Anne ringed in the middle of the classroom. She was a very chatty little girl in class. She was very outgoing, very gregarious, and she loved her friends. And you know what? She often got into trouble with her teacher and was held behind at school and made to do lines for talking in class. The building is still a school, and it's now known as the Anne Frank School. And you can go and visit it. And on the wall, that's not graffiti done by an unruly child, but it's put there on purpose, the writing, because it replicates Anne's writing in her diary. Here's some more photographs taken by Mr. Frank of Anne and her friends playing. You can probably recognise some of the toys because they're very familiar to the toys our kids have now. So there's Anne in the left-hand picture in the lighter colour outfit, and her friend Susanna Lederman, you probably recognise, in the darker outfit. Playing with items like a hoop and a scooter. My little 3-year-old grandson has just taken delivery of his first scooter. So I say to younger children, elementary children, when I'm doing a talk to them, don't the toys that Anne and her friends played with look very familiar to you? The other question I'm asked a lot is how come these photographs survived when the family went into hiding? Well, in fact, Otto Frank sent a huge cache of photographs to his family in Switzerland before the family went into hiding. There were no photographs taken once the family were in hiding, but that's actually how the photos survived. They were sent to Switzerland. Now, this photograph of Anne looking at her watch was taken just on the steps outside Mr. Frank's offices on the Single. And now the Single is a lovely place to visit because there's a beautiful flower market there. And if you walk along the canal, you will find number 400 where Mr. Frank had his first office. He moved to 263 Prinsengracht in 1939. And you can see that the photograph is a composite of the photograph that Otto took of Anne, but set against a photograph merged with a photograph taken in modern day Amsterdam, which really is very evocative to imagine that standing that very place where Anne stood and looked at her watch. This photograph was taken on Anne's 10th birthday, the 12th of June, 1939. And it wasn't coloured by Mr. Frank, it was hand coloured by someone on the internet. And I think it's really lovely because it really brings these girls to life. So this is her birthday party. Interesting, this photograph, because there's Anne, you can see in the blue dress, second from the left. The little girl on the far left of the photo is her friend Jacqueline van Marsen, who actually still lives in Amsterdam, direct contemporary of Anne. She would be 91 now. I've met her on several occasions. And then the other side of Anne, again, you might recognise that little gorgeous little dark-haired girl from the earlier photos. That's her friend Susanna Lederman. Now, tragically, Susanna's family were all deported to Auschwitz in 1943, and Susanna, sweet little Susanna, was gassed on arrival at Auschwitz. A slightly taller girl, sort of bowing her head, is Anne's friend Hannah Pitt-Goslar. And again, she's still alive and she lives in Jerusalem, and I've met her several times. She's a lovely lady. She's known as Lies Goossens in Anne's diary. Now, the 5 girls on the right are Anne's non-Jewish friends. She had a wide circle of friends. And interestingly, the tall girl right bang in the middle, by the time this photograph was taken in 1939, her father had already joined the Dutch Nazi Party. Now, just 11 months after that lovely photograph was taken, the unthinkable happens. And on May the 10th, 1940, Germany bombs the Dutch port of Rotterdam, a very strategic port for them. It's on the mouth of the Rhine. After 5 days of intensive bombing, Rotterdam is completely flattened and the Dutch capitulate. Now, if you visit Rotterdam, you will see a very different city from, for example, Amsterdam or Delft, where you have these beautiful historic buildings. Rotterdam is essentially a very modern city because it was completely rebuilt after the war because it was flattened. There is a very small old quarter of the city, but a very different feel from Amsterdam. So after the city is completely bombed, the Dutch capitulate and Germany then invades the Netherlands. The Dutch government and the Dutch royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, flee to London. By 1941, due to the restrictive measures brought in against the Jews, Anne and Margot have to leave their school and they can only attend a Jewish school. Mr. Frank is forced to hand his business over to his non-Jewish employees. Fortunately, he had very trustworthy managers and they ran the business for him, and he kept a benign eye on what was going on in the business. Now, a couple of years after this, when Anne is writing in her diary, she writes about what it felt like as the measures against the Jews were being brought in. Now, remember, Anne was a very outgoing girl. She loved her friends. Margot, her older sister, as well as being very, very academic, she was also very sporty and belonged to a rowing club, a tennis club. In the winter, these girls would love to go ice skating, and in the summer, they would love to go swimming. So imagine, Anne writes, after May 1940, the good times were few and far between. Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. We had to wear a yellow star, turn in our bicycles. We were forbidden to ride on trams or to go to theatres, cinemas, or other forms of entertainment, swimming pools, tennis courts, or other athletic fields. You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. But life went on. Now, in February 1942, the German occupiers of the Netherlands issue a decree to say that young people between the ages of 16 and 40 must report to be sent to work camps in the East, that is in Germany. Very few of these young people ever returned. So Mr. and Mrs. Frank, you can imagine, Margot has turned 16 in that same month in February. So they're getting increasingly worried about Margot. However, on June the 12th, 1942, Anne turns 13. And just a few days before her birthday, she and her father are walking in the vicinity near the Moveda Plain apartment, and Anne happens to spot in the window of the local bookstore just around the corner this beautiful little red check fabric-coloured notebook. Probably what attracted her to it was this, a little brass lock. And what 13-year-old doesn't want a brass lock on a little notebook that she's going to be writing her thoughts down into? So she drops a few hints to her dad, and like, you know, our kids do when it's coming up to birthdays or Christmas time. And Mr. Frank goes back and buys the notebook. He and his wife wrap it up and present it to Anne as one of her birthday gifts for her 13th birthday. And she starts writing in that little notebook straight away. She starts writing at first about her school friends. She's rather gossipy and she's not exactly very kind about all the girls and boys in her class. And she starts soon realizing that this is going to be her most intimate confidant, which is quite surprising from a girl that says she has hundreds of friends and several boyfriends that can't keep their eyes off me. But this is going to be her real friend, and she's going to really open up and share her most intimate thoughts with her little red check notebook, which she soon calls her diary. And she gives it a name, actually. She calls her diary Kitty, after one of the characters in her very favourite novel. Now, just 3 weeks after, I just wanted to show you that, because if you want to see the bookstore, the very bookstore where Anne spotted the red check notebook and Mr. Frank dashed back to buy it, it's still in existence just around the corner from the Moveda Plain. You can see the address, the Roosevelt line. So if you get the tram down to that area, you can walk around the area and see all these places of interest. As I say, it's still a bookstore. It's changed hands. It's in different hands now. And it was the owner of the bookstore now that put the statue up in the Moveda Plain to honour Anne. So that's the exact bookstore where Anne spotted the red check notebook. However, they are getting increasingly worried about Margot. And over the months between the February decree and the summer, Mr. Frank, aided by two of his staff, his trustworthy staff, start preparing a hiding place for the Frank family, should they need to go into hiding very quickly if Margot is called up to be deported to a work camp. Now, Otto had actually tried desperately to get his family out of Europe. But even with the help and support of the influential Strauss family of New York, of course, who owned Macy's, it was impossible to get visas to go to America. The doors were firmly closed. So this is the actual building of the 263 Prinsengracht, which you will see from the outside when you visit Amsterdam. It's a typical merchant's building dating from 1635, and it was built by the very popular architect of the time, Dirk van Delft. And the front renovation dates actually from 1740. So at the back and top of that building, it's like a rabbit warren of rooms. On the ground floor was the warehouse where they kept where they stored all the spices and the pectin, manufactured the pectin. And on the second floor was were all the offices, and then there were rooms above. But at the back of that building, right at the back and the top, was a set of rooms that no one really knew existed, and the staff certainly never went up there. And so Mr. Frank, helped by his two trustworthy managers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, started preparing a set of rooms. Now, that was no easy task to prepare a hiding place, because they could only do it at night when the workers had gone home. And when you're walking around Amsterdam, if you look up, you'll see, and you can see at the top of this flat roof, all the buildings have hooks. And that's because they're very steep, very narrow. Remember, I mentioned the stairs to you, very steep and narrow. Very, very difficult to get large furniture and items up those steep stairs. And so generally, furniture and large items were hoisted up on these hooks. And of course, they couldn't do that because they didn't want to draw attention. So secretly, in the evening, they were bringing that furniture, heavy furniture, up those stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. One of the staff members, Victor Kugler, suggested that it would be an idea to hide the door to the secret annex, the hiding place, with a bookcase, which would look authentic, and it would have like office folders and files. And once the family were in hiding, if they needed to go into hiding, then they would close the bookcase against the wall. And when you visit the Anne Frank house, you actually walk into the secret annex behind that bookcase, the very same bookcase that Anne would have walked behind to go into hiding. And there's Mr. Frank in later years at the bookcase. Now, as a surprise for Anne, going into hiding, Mr. Frank has been gathering up some of her favourite photographs of movie stars and of royal families. Anne loved the British and Dutch royal family. And if you look at the photograph on the right, those are some of the photographs that he brought in a box for her as a surprise to stick on her bedroom wall to remind her of home. And actually, you can see facing you two little light-coloured pictures of Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, Elizabeth now being the Queen, and as little girls. And Anne adored the British royal family. And a few years ago, I was taking the Queen's youngest son, the Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward, around the exhibition. And I said, the Anne Frank exhibition, and I said, oh, look, there's a photograph there, sir, of Anne's bedroom. Is there anyone you recognise? And he sort of looked and looked and looked. And he said, oh, there's my mother. So that is indeed the Queen as a little girl, which Anne loved the British princesses. Now, on the 5th of July, Sunday, there was a ring at the doorbell of the Franks' Nevada Lane apartment, and it was a postman delivering the dreaded call-up notice for Margot. There was no time to lose. The very next day, on the 6th of July, the Frank family went into hiding. They had to walk across Amsterdam from the south to the centre of the city in the pouring rain, and that's maybe why no one really noticed them, because it was pouring with rain. And they went up the stairs. They went very early in the morning before the staff arrived, up the stairs into the secret hiding place and closed that bookcase against them. Now, at first, Anne was very excited about the thought of going into hiding, and she wrote about this very comfortable little pension house, pension, a hotel, that must be the most cosy place in the whole of Amsterdam. But I have to tell you that after a few months, she didn't feel quite so warmly about it. This was her bedroom that she at first shared with her sister Margot. But a few months later, a dentist, a local dentist called Fritz Pfeffer, Jewish, in fear of his life, came to join them in hiding. And Anne could no longer share with Margot because of space. Margot went in to share a bedroom with her parents, and Anne had to share with the dreaded Mr. Pfeffer, Fritz Pfeffer. He's called Mr. Dussel, which means stupid in Anne's diary, penned by Anne. But in actual fact, he was a very good-looking, very athletic man of about 45. Anne gives him a terrible press in the diary. She hated sharing a room with him, particularly because he snored, but also because he was a great disciplinarian. Another family also joined them about a week after they had first gone into hiding, and that was the Van Pels family. And it was Herman Van Pels who was Mr. Frank's business associate in the sausage spices business, part of the business, and they had a 16-year-old son called Peter. So by the end of the year 1942, there were actually 8 people in hiding. Now, Anne had, of course, her little check notebook with her in hiding, and this became a huge source of comfort to her. Actually, writing was something that she wanted to do nearly every day, and she wrote about all aspects of the life in hiding, what was going on in the hiding place, the fights between the adults, and of course the fights between her and her sister and her parents, no holds barred. And she wrote very openly about her fears of what was going on in the outside world. She wrote about her dreams of growing up and her ambitions, imagining her future life when the war was over, and her dreams of being a writer. She actually wrote, "When I write, I can share off all my cares. My sorrow disappears. My spirits are revived." This picture shows myself quite a few years ago, about 25 years ago, with Miep, who was one of the helpers of those 8 people in hiding. Now imagine that there were 8 people in hiding and it turned out for just over 2 years. You cannot be in hiding without being helped. And Mr. Frank's senior staff, that is Miep, the administrator in the photograph, his secretary, Bet Voskill, and his 2 senior managers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who'd helped him prepare the hiding place, risked their lives, not just a day, not just a week, not just a month, but for over 2 years to bring food, medicines, supplies, and moral support to those 8 desperate people in hiding. And believe me, that was no easy feat, because remember, the Netherlands was occupied and it was very difficult to find food for their own families, let alone for 8 people in hiding. This remarkable woman, Miep, who I was so privileged to spend a lot of time with in the 1990s and 2000s, sadly she died in 2010, but she reached the great age of 100. She even used to get on her bicycle and cycle miles out into the country to the Dutch farms to get food to feed all those people. But also she was hiding a young Dutch boy, non-Jewish, but had refused to join the Nazi party. She was hiding him in her own home. So these people were risking their lives every single day to look after the Franks and the other people in hiding. So I was very privileged to spend time with her. And probably one of the greatest days I'll ever remember is Miep and myself attending the 1996 Academy Awards in Hollywood, where a documentary that I had commissioned about Anne Frank actually was up for an Academy Award, and of course it won. And the director and producer John Blair, in the bottom picture, he went up on the stage in Hollywood in front of 1 billion people watching around the world with this small white-haired elderly lady. And of course people were sort of bemused looking, who was this lady? I mean, normally you see these glamorous movie stars going up on the stage. And John Blair's words to 1 billion people watching this around the world was, "Ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one." And you can imagine, I mean, I was in the auditorium, the whole auditorium just erupted when they realized that this was the heroic woman who'd risked her life to save Anne Frank and her family. One of those most memorable evenings I'll never forget. After D-Day, on 6th of June 1944, hopes were really high in the secret annex among those 8 people that they were soon going to be liberated. And actually one of the things you will see in the Anne Frank house when you visit, very poignant, behind a glass, it's authentic, is a map that Mr. Frank had stuck on the wall and was putting pins in where the armies, the Allied armies of the British, the Americans, Canadians, were advancing towards Amsterdam. But sadly, after June the 6th, the advance was much slower across Europe than they had anticipated. The Allies were first caught in Belgium at the Battle of the Bulge, and then in southern Netherlands in Arnhem. And it took them actually many months to get to Amsterdam. So in the secret annex, the 8 people are really optimistic that they are soon going to be liberated. Anne writes in her diary, "I feel that friends are on the way and maybe I can go back to school by the fall." However, August the 4th, 1944, a beautiful, warm, sunny day in Amsterdam, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, someone, and we'll never know who, makes a call to the Gestapo and the Dutch police and say there are Jews hiding on the Prinsengracht. And at 10:30, a Gestapo officer called Joseph Silberbaum, accompanied by Dutch policemen, burst into the offices of Mr. Frank's business and, pointing pistols at Miep and Mr. Kugler and Mr. Kleiman, indicate that they must open the bookcase. Up they go, up to the secret annex, and arrest all 8 people in hiding. They are taken to Westerbork transit camp in the north of the Netherlands. And on September the 3rd, all 8 Jews in hiding were deported from the Netherlands to Auschwitz camp in Poland. Now, ironically, had they been arrested perhaps a few weeks later, they would not have been on that transport and deported to Poland, because that was actually the last train out of the Netherlands to Poland. They arrive at Auschwitz on September the 6th after a 3-day horrendous journey in a cattle truck. And on the platform at Auschwitz, the men, that is Otto Frank, Mr. Van Pels, Herman Van Pels is a business associate, Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist, and Peter Van Pels, the 16-year-old son of the Pels family, are taken away to slave labor. And the women, Mrs. Frank, Mrs. Van Pels, and Anne and Margot are sent to the barracks at Birkenau. At the end of October of that year, Margot and Anne are selected to be sent back to Germany, the country of their birth, to Bergen-Belsen camp. They are separated from their desperate mother, and they are sent on a long train journey, arrive in Bergen-Belsen. Now, maybe they thought that there was more chance for them to survive in the country of their birth. However, by that time, Bergen-Belsen was pretty much abandoned, and the drinking water was contaminated. There was very little food, and there were waves of this deadly disease of typhus going through the camp. It was very difficult to survive typhus if you were malnourished, as the inmates were. Sometime in the spring, February or March 1945, we will never know when, Anne and Margot died within about a day of each other. Margot died first, followed by Anne. They had given up. They were despairing. They thought they were orphans. Ironically, by the time those girls lay dying and were thrown into a mass grave, their father, Otto Frank, had been liberated from Auschwitz. He was barely alive. If it had been another week or so of the Russians coming to liberate Auschwitz, he wouldn't have survived. He was so sick. Now, of course, the gravestone wasn't actually put up for Margot and Anne in 1945. They were thrown into a huge mass pit with thousands of others. But it was actually put up fairly recently by their late cousin in Switzerland, Buddy Elias, a very great friend of mine, until he died a few years ago. And so if you visit Bergen-Belsen camp, you will see the gravestone to Margot and Anne, but there are very few other gravestones to the hundreds of thousands of people who died in those terrible deaths there. Now, Otto Frank took about 5 months to get back to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, because, of course, when he was liberated from Auschwitz in Poland, Western Europe was still at war. He arrived back in June after the liberation of the Netherlands in May 1945. And he's desperate for news of his daughters. And he even puts an advert in the local newspaper if anyone has news of Margot and Anne Frank. But one day he's actually working in his office because he went back into the business, and a telegram arrives from the International Red Cross bearing the terrible, terrible news that both his daughters have died in Bergen-Belsen. He comes out of that office, his office, and he says to Miep Hies, who's sitting at her desk, "Miep, the girls are no more." And with that, Miep goes to her desk drawer and she pulls out, of all things, Anne's little red check diary. And she says, "Here you are, Mr. Frank. Here is the legacy of your daughter." Otto goes away and reads his daughter's diary and realizes that he never really knew the hidden depths of his daughter. Because as she was maturing in hiding over those 2 years, when she was transitioning really from a child into an adolescent, as well as everything that comes with adolescence, with the feelings of emotional turmoil, which, by the way, all her emotional feelings of growing up and romance and love and sex, she actually focused on Peter Van Pels, the young teenager who was in hiding. And they would sort of sneak away up to the dusty old attic above the hiding place just to have some time together. It was very innocent, although Anne wrote very candidly about her feelings towards Peter, but she did enjoy her first teenage kiss and probably her only teenage kiss up in that attic. And so she wrote very candidly about everything. And so Otto realised he never really knew the hidden depths of his teenage daughter. Teenagers, huh? I'm sure we can say the same about our own. But what to do with this diary? Because Miep had very bravely, after the families had been arrested, gone up and broken the lock the Gestapo and police had put on the door and rescued anything she could for the Frank family, because it was late in the war, the Allies were advancing, and hopefully they'd be liberated soon and the Frank family would come home. But she found on the floor, all she really found was the diary and other notebooks and papers that Anne had been writing over the 2 years. She scooped them up and she put them in her desk drawer to give back to Anne. She never read it. She never read this because she knew it was Anne's secret diary. She knew she was going to give it to Anne. So Otto goes away, having been given this red check notebook by Miep, and reads it. And it gives him a moral dilemma, because on the one hand, he knew that Anne's greatest wish was to have been a published author. But on the other hand, Anne wrote very, very disparagingly and critically about her mother, her sister, and the other adults in hiding who'd all lost their lives so cruelly under the Nazis. So he shows the diary to a few trusted friends, including a literary critic, Jan Romein. And Jan Romein, the literary critic, writes a piece about the diary that says everybody must read this diary, and it's published on the front of the Amsterdam newspaper. And because of that, a publisher comes forward and agrees to publish Anne's diary in a limited edition of 1,500 copies. It's published on the 25th of June 1947 and it's called Het Achterhuis, the back house. By the end of that year, it's been published in a second edition. By the following year, a third edition. And the rest, they say, is history. Now, the publisher, being a Catholic publisher, they deemed a lot of what Anne wrote about as highly unsuitable for people to read in 1940s Europe. So they did cut quite a bit of Anne's diary out. Also, Otto edited some of the diary, not the writing, but he edited out certain passages that he felt were pretty cruel to his late wife, daughter, and the others in hiding. So the version that was published in 1947 is 1/3 less than any version of Anne's diary that's been published since 1997. If you buy a copy of Anne's diary now, you will only get the full unexpurgated version. Now, in one of her first entries, Anne wrote, "Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me, not only because I've never written anything before, but also it seems to me that later on neither I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old girl." Well, she wrote that a week after receiving the diary. Not interested, eh? Well, to date, the diary has sold over 30 million copies. And we used to say that it was probably the most widely read book, non-fiction book in the English language after the Bible. But of course, that was before Harry Potter came along. It's been translated into 70 different languages. Now, I was actually walking through Bangkok airport several years ago, and I saw a copy of Anne's diary in the Thai language in the Bangkok airport bookstore. And someone attended one of my lectures last year, and she sent me a photograph that she'd taken of a translation of Anne's diary in an Ethiopian dialect that she had spotted in a market in Addis Ababa. So you can see Anne's diary is taking off all around the world. Now, around 1960, the diary is becoming a phenomenon. young people, teenagers around the world are writing letters to Mr. Frank because they feel, because of how Anne describes her father in the diary, is a very liberal-minded, forward-thinking man, considering he was from a German background. He was very liberal, he was very worldly. Listen, he'd spent time in New York. He got a wonderful press in Anne's diary. But young people, of course, in the 1950s and 60s, they didn't feel they could confide in their parents or their teachers like kids do now. So they would start writing letters to Mr. Frank. And Mr. Frank and his second wife, Fritzi Geringer, another Auschwitz survivor, he married in 1953, they devoted the second half of their life to answering every letter they ever received, answering on an old typewriter. People, you know, just were starting to come to look at the place where Anne had hidden from across the canal. It was becoming like a place of pilgrimage. Remember, in 1955, there'd been a play produced on Broadway called The Diary of Anne Frank. In 1960, there was the George Stevens movie, which you may recall Shelley Winters won an Oscar for, her portrayal of Mrs. Van Pels. The area around 263 Prinsengracht, remember these are 17th century buildings, they're very old, is becoming derelict. And Mr. Frank goes to see the mayor of Amsterdam to plead with him not to knock the building down, because in those days, you know, in the early 1960s, anything old was knocked down, it wasn't given a value, it wouldn't be knocked down today. And he says, if we can raise some money, I would like to turn the building into a museum. But Mr. Frank's vision was not a backward-looking memorial. He wanted to see an education centre so that young people would not have to suffer the persecution and hatred on the grounds of their religion or race that his own daughters had died from. And so in 1960, the mayor of Amsterdam and the West German government and friends and donors, generous donors, gave Mr. Frank money to convert the building into a museum. And this photograph by the photographer Arnold Levin was actually taken of Mr. Frank on the very day of its opening on the 10th of May 1960. And there he is upstairs in that dusty old attic where Anne and Peter used to go to spend some time alone as teenagers. You can only imagine what his thoughts are. And he started having student conferences in the building, inviting young people from all over Europe to come and get to know each other, including, by the way, from the land of his birth, Germany, even just 15 years after this poor man was liberated, nearly dead, from Auschwitz. He was determined that education and bringing people together was the way forward. Now, when you visit the Anne Frank house, as I hope you're going to, you will see an authentic copy, the original diary. Now, the diary is actually owned by the Dutch government. Of course, there's a whole room showing just some of the many, many international editions of the diary. You will see this, it's under, by the way, it's under shatterproof and bulletproof glass. It's actually owned not by the Anne Frank House, it's owned by the Dutch government, and it's on permanent loan to the Anne Frank House. And then obviously you will have proceeded through the hiding place, you'll come down into a wonderful display of the many international editions, and you'll see the original diary. The building of the Anne Frank House actually also contains many offices because there are huge teams of educators and researchers working there. Now, Anne wrote about the only view of the outside world she could see from the window, the top window in that dusty old attic that she and Peter used to go up to visit. Because, of course, in the secret hiding place, all the windows were blacked out with blinds because they didn't want anyone to see in. And her only view of the world over those 2 years in hiding was the top of this beautiful old chestnut tree that was in the garden behind the hiding place. And she wrote a lot about that tree in her diary because she could see the seasons changing through the leaves of the tree. And she wrote in 1944, "Our chestnut tree is in leaf, and here and there you can already see a few blossoms." Now, sadly, in 2009, that tree was felled in a terrible storm. And it was so historic, it had been there for hundreds of years. But saplings from that tree have actually been planted in sites across the world, including many sites in America that have been planted by the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in New York, which I'm very proud to say that I work very closely with. And so here, if you want to see a sapling from Anne Frank's actual chestnut tree, you can go and visit one outside the Capitol building in DC, outside the United Nations that was planted a couple of years ago, and outside the Clinton Presidential Library in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was there just about 18 months ago, pre-pandemic, giving a talk, and I was able to see the Anne Frank tree at the Clinton Center. It was absolutely marvelous. I know there's one in Boston on the site of where the Boston Marathon bombing, and there are several other sites around, significant sites around America. So if you go into the Anne Frank Center website, annefrank.com, very easy, you'll find out maybe there's an Anne Frank sapling from that very tree somewhere near where you live. Now, I'm going to sort of quickly run through a few other places of interest in your visit to Amsterdam. Now, Anne writes in her diary very much about the Westertoren, which is the beautiful 17th century clock tower of the church just around the corner. And she writes about how much comfort the chiming of those bells of the Westertoren clock have been to her in hiding. And you read her diary, you'll see many references to the Westertoren clock. Now, it's a beautiful tower, and there's a beautiful globe sort of orb and crown at the top of it. And you can see it from most areas of Amsterdam, just around the corner from the Prinsengracht. You can't miss it. And that was donated to the Dutch people in the 17th century by the Archduke Maximilian of Austria because of their loyalty. So it was a gift in gratitude. Another thing she writes about the quarter hourly chiming. She writes in July 1942, "Father, Mother and Margot still can't get used to the chiming of the Westertoren clock, which tells us the time every quarter of an hour. Not me. I liked it from the start. It sounds so reassuring, especially at night." And it's actually, the Westerkerk is a beautiful building, built around exactly the same time as the Anne Frank house, 1635, and by the same architect, Dirk van Delft, who was a very popular architect in 17th century Amsterdam. Now, we spent an absolutely unforgettable morning inside the Westerkerk. You can go inside, you can see it, it's beautiful inside, you can see how magnificent it is. In May 2010, which if you worked out from your arithmetic, that's exactly 50 years since May 1960, when the Anne Frank house opened. And it was Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands who helped the Anne Frank house mark the 50th anniversary on that unforgettable morning. Now, somewhere Anne talks about in her diary, and they loved to visit before they went into hiding, was the little resort town of Zandvoort on the coast, immediately due east of Amsterdam. And you can get the train there from Amsterdam, only takes about half an hour. If you want to visit the very beach where Anne and Margot used to spend their summers, and you can see this gorgeous photograph of them on the beach, and you can just sort of walk along the beach and imagine Anne and Margot really enjoying their summer. The town is actually quite famous for its Formula One racing circuit, and at one time it actually hosted the Dutch Grand Prix. It was closed because they wanted to do a lot of work on it, and it was supposed to open last year for the Grand Prix, the Dutch Grand Prix, but of course there was no Grand Prix. Hopefully maybe it will open this year and maybe next year, and you can see the Dutch Grand Prix there. So that's Zandvoort, 30 minutes due west, I beg your pardon, due west from Amsterdam on the coast. Now this place has very, very ominous connections. When the Frank family and Fritz Pfeffer and the Van Pels family, the 8 of them, were all arrested, they were driven down to this building, this very building for interrogation. And this was the headquarters of the SD, which is the sister organization of the Gestapo. You can only imagine how terrified those people were. You know, it was like so close. They felt the Allies were advancing. They were so near to liberation. You can only imagine how they felt. And this is where they were interrogated before they were sent off to Westerbork camp. It's in the south of the city, and this is that very same building, and it's now a college called the Gerrit van de Veen College, and it's named after a hero of the Dutch resistance. And when you're walking around Amsterdam, this is the most beautiful place for you to go and visit, and it's called the Pathé Tuschinski. You can see the address there, Regular Breestraat, if you want to make a note of it. It's still a cinema. It opened as a cinema in 1921. It was built by a Polish man called Abraham Tuschinski, and it cost 4 million guilders in the time. Now, it was really advanced and ahead of its time. A spectacular mix of architectural styles. And when you walk into the lobby, it gives you the feeling that you're stepping into a grand illusion. Now, Abraham Tuschinski himself, the man with this great vision to build this incredible theatre, he was born in Lodz in Poland, and he happened to be en route to America when he stopped off in Rotterdam and decided to stay. He liked the vibe there. And as well as this beautiful theatre in Amsterdam, he opened 4 theatres in Rotterdam. But of course, they were flattened when the Germans bombed Rotterdam in 1940. In 1942, Tuschinski himself was deported to Auschwitz and murdered. Now, it's still a cinema, and if you're staying overnight in Amsterdam, it's a wonderful experience to go and see a movie in this incredible theatre. Now, in 1994, it was the highly appropriate venue of the European premiere of Schindler's List. And I was invited by the Anne Frank House to attend the premiere because it was an unforgettable evening. And I managed to nobble Steven Spielberg in the reception, and he kindly agreed to be one of the first patrons of the Anne Frank Trust UK, which, by the way, it was a very small organisation in those days. I think perhaps he thought he was becoming patron of the Anne Frank House, but I managed to nobble him to be my patron. So really do go and look out for that, the Theatre Tuschinski. And also, when you're walking around Amsterdam, in the Jewish Cultural Quarter, you have got the Jewish Historical Museum and the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, where you will get an understanding of the experience of the Dutch Jews under the occupation and, of course, the Holocaust. The building itself dates from 1675. You know, Amsterdam is full of these old treasures. And it was originally home to the sizable Sephardi community who'd originally come from Portugal and Spain. And it's right in the heart of the Jewish quarter. And around the corner there is the Waterlooplein. And this monument, it's a very noticeable monument. It's a monument to all the Dutch Jewish resistance fighters killed by the Nazis. Now, the Waterlooplein actually, of course, was named after the Battle of Waterloo. It's a flea. It became a flea market. It was a market originally run, a Jewish market, but of course, as the Jews were being deported, the market was sort of closed down. There was no one to run the stalls as they were being murdered. But now it's a flea market, and it has 300 lovely stalls. It's not open on a Sunday, by the way, but you can go there and get that feeling of being down in this very historic quarter. Now, this is something very interesting that was erected in about 1984. And it's right bang, just around the corner from the Anne Frank House and right by the Westerkerk. You can't miss it. It's a big sort of open area, and it's called the Homo Monument. And it's a monument for all the gay and lesbians subjected to persecution because of their sexuality. Now, the idea of this memorial dates back to 1970, when gay activists were arrested trying to put a lavender wreath at the Dutch National War Memorial. The wreath was removed and destroyed by police, and it was denounced as a disgrace. Now, in 1979, the Dutch gay and lesbian rights movement started raising funds for a monument to the persecution of the gay and lesbian community. And they got lots of support from the Dutch Parliament and the city of Amsterdam, plus activists all around Europe. And eventually, after 8 years, they managed to raise the funds to erect this monument. And it really is very stunning. It's very unusual. It's in the shape of a triangle because when the gays and lesbians were arrested and put into camps, they had to wear, whereas the Jews had to wear a yellow star, they had to wear a pink triangle. So it's very much the symbol of their persecution during the war. And you can sit on the steps on one of the points of the triangle, or you can sit on a raised area. And it's always full of people sort of paying their respects. You can't miss it. It's just around the corner from the Anne Frank house. Now, what I want to do is give you a little flavour of the Dutch monarchy. And the reason being that Anne loved the Dutch royal family. And when I'm working on the ship with Viking, very often we're going to Scandinavian and Northern European countries. So I did develop a talk on the Northern European royal families that still remain. And of course, the Dutch royal family is very prominent among the Northern European royal families. So here we go. You'll be very surprised to know that it's actually one of the youngest monarchies in the world. And the Netherlands only became a monarchy in the year 1815. Prior to that, it was a republic, and it was ruled by the head of state, the stadtholder. After the expulsion of Napoleon in 1815, and of course the Congress of Vienna, they appointed Prince Willem Frederik of Oranje, spelt as orange but pronounced by the Dutch as Oranje. He was the son of the last head of state, stateholder, and he decided he was going to be King Willem I of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And the monarchy soon became quite popular. But I'm going to jump now to the end of the 19th century with the birth of Queen Wilhelmina. And Wilhelmina, she actually reigned from the year 1890 all the way through to 1948. Her reign covered 2 world wars. She was actually became the queen when she was only 10 years old. And you can see the very young queen in the picture on the left, in the painting on the left. So because she was so young, her mother served as the regent until she was able to become queen at age 18, which you must admit is very young to be a queen. Then when she was 21, she married a German duke, an aristocrat. And Wilhelmina reigned nearly 58 years. I mean, longer than any other Dutch monarch. During the Second World War, you'll remember that I said that the Dutch royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, fled into exile in London. And she actually was giving broadcasts via the BBC to the Dutch nation to keep up their morale. She became the spirit of the morale of the nation. And Anne writes about those broadcasts in her diary. On September the 21st, 1942, she writes, "I sometimes listen to the Dutch broadcasts from London. No one here understands why I take such an interest in the royal family." Now, the Frank family actually had a clandestine wireless in the hiding place, which was very, very dangerous. But every night when the staff would go home, they would put this little wireless on very quietly to hear what was happening in the rest of Europe. Now, Wilhelmina's daughter, the next queen, was Juliana. And Juliana also married a German aristocrat called Prince Bernhard. Now, she married him in 1937, just a couple of years before the invasion of the Netherlands by the Germans. And her marriage was quite controversial because Bernhard was supposedly pro-Nazi. He had been a member of the Nazi Party. But in World War II, Prince Bernhard actually fought for the Allies, for the British RAF, and he became a pilot. Now, after the war, Prince Bernhard became a businessman, and he helped to fund the World Wildlife Fund. In 1976, however, he became embroiled in a very large scandal. You may remember it was the Lockheed scandal, Lockheed being aircraft manufacturers. And it was alleged that Prince Bernhard had accepted a bribe for over $1 million from Lockheed to try and influence the Dutch government into purchasing fighter aircraft. And damning letters from the prince surfaced where he was demanding commissions for his introductions. And so in 1980, Queen Juliana, who was a very popular queen, actually abdicated in favour of her daughter. They also reckon it was because of Prince Bernhard's extramarital affairs, which produced several children as well. She abdicated in favour of her daughter, Princess Beatrix, who became queen. And Beatrix reigned from 1980 to 2013, when she too abdicated in favour of her son. Believe it or not, Beatrix's choice of husband was also controversial. She married, again, a German nobleman called Claus von Amsberg in 1966. And the wedding was so controversial that there were demonstrations and there were smoke bombs thrown at the wedding because Claus was actually a member of the Hitler Youth, which of course all young fit Germans in those days, during the Nazi regime, really had very little choice but to join the Hitler Youth. But Claus threw himself into popular causes and good works, and his style became very informal. He hated wearing ties. Now, it's very interesting because Wilhelmina's style as a queen was very formal. You can imagine she was born in the 19th century. Her daughter Juliana had a much more informal style, and she was often seen cycling around Amsterdam and The Hague. And this gave rise to this impression that all the Dutch royals were very, very informal. But when Beatrix became queen, she kind of contradicted that because she was very formal in her manner and her style. She would always have her hair bouffant and coiffed and hairsprayed, and always wore these big, powerful looking hats. Generally, though, I have to say that the vibe in Amsterdam is very informal and very different from the towns and in the rest of the Netherlands, particularly those in the countryside. You're likely to find fewer English speakers when you go outside Amsterdam. And people are much more formal generally. They're Dutch Protestant Reformed Church. Now, in 2013, Beatrix also abdicated in favour of her son, Wilhelm Alexander of Oranje. Now, he also had a very controversial choice of consort. Because in 1999, he was at a conference in Seville and he met a beautiful Argentinian economist called Maxima Zorreguieta. Very bright lady, by the way, very clever economist. And he introduced himself not as Prince Willem Alexander of the Netherlands, but simply Willem. And they got on very well, and she had no idea who he was until eventually he confessed that he was the Crown Prince of the Netherlands, by which time they had fallen in love. But there was a problem, because Maxima's father was actually a minister in the notorious Argentinian dictatorship of General Videla and under the Dirty War. And so there was fierce public debate about whether their crown prince should marry the daughter of someone associated with that terrible dictatorship. But the marriage was officially sanctioned after there was quiet diplomacy, and Maxima's father agreed that he would not come to Amsterdam for the wedding. Now, she has become hugely popular in the Netherlands because she's taken on a wide range of humanitarian causes. And I know that at one time she was actually an economic advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, there they are at their coronation. You can see with their three beautiful daughters, looking very formal. And by the way, the next monarch to rule the Netherlands will also be a queen, because the couple have three daughters. And now you can see their informal style. There they are cycling around. I'm not sure whether it's The Hague or Rotterdam or Amsterdam, but they're very, very informal couple. I have met the king at a premiere of a show in Amsterdam that I was invited to, and we had a lovely chat. And actually in 2010, marking the 50th anniversary of the Anne Frank house, Princess Maxima, of course now she's the Queen, invited all our Anne Frank international colleagues from all around the world who'd assembled in Amsterdam to mark it to coffee at the Dam Palace. And you might spot me, I'm the little one. She's very tall and statuesque, Maxima, in pink, and I'm the little one next to her. And she was absolutely charming and absolutely so interested in what we had to tell her about the Anne Frank work around the world. In 1943, Anne is really missing her outside life and everything that signalled freedom to her. And she wrote, "I long to ride a bike, dance, whistle, look at the world, feel young and know that I am free." Cycling is very big in the Netherlands, partly because it's such a flat country. It's a tradition. And I just want to warn you, if you are walking around Amsterdam, and I know there's going to be a wonderful talk on cycling a bit later this week on Viking.TV, please be very careful and look both ways. You don't have the problem that I have, being English, that for me, they're riding on the wrong side of the road, because for Americans, they are not riding on the wrong side of the road. But you are much more likely to get run over in Amsterdam by a cycle than either a car or a tram. So please watch your step. They'll be ringing their bells all the way along. Be very careful stepping out because of the cyclists. There are thousands of them. Since 1985, the Anne Frank House has been creating a travelling exhibition that's been going all around the world. And I just wanted to show you one example of someone who opened the Anne Frank exhibition way back in 1994. And that was Nelson Mandela. And I could have spent another hour taking you on a whistle-stop tour of the world, all these amazing places where the Anne Frank exhibition has literally changed young people's lives and perceptions. Some amazing places. That's for another time and another lecture. But I chose, I guess, South Africa because of the Dutch connection. In 1994, when he had just been president for only 4 months, Nelson Mandela opened the Anne Frank exhibition in Johannesburg. And he told about how he had read Anne's diary even before he went into prison. Had a profound effect on him. But when he was on Robben Island for all those years in the prison, he actually smuggled a copy of Anne's diary into the prison and encouraged the prisoners to read it. And so much so that it was so well read under Mandela's directive that the little paperback edition just fell to bits. And the prisoners actually copied out the pages of Anne's diary by hand in their prison at night. So just so that they could keep reading Anne's diary. And I also want to show you the travelling exhibit, how it's used now in schools and communities all around the world, but particularly in the United States as well. This photograph was taken at a school in South Carolina, and the exhibition is being shown by what we call a peer educator, because what we do with the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in America, we train teenagers to be our educators, because they're educating other teenagers about a teenage girl. And it's been a hugely successful program that's been operated all around the world, particularly in areas of great social deprivation and division. And it gives young people a sense of importance and responsibility that they can be Anne Frank educators. We even do this in prisons as well. So there we are. I've taken you through Amsterdam and we've seen it through Anne's eyes. So when you next visit Amsterdam and you're walking those streets, think of young Anne who just wanted to live her life. but because she was considered Untermenschen, subhuman, by her persecutors, she died the most terrible death in Bergen-Belsen camp of starvation and disease. Now, on the 15th of July 1944, Anne wrote in her diary, "It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty will end and peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them. Yours, Anne M. Frank." And just a quick plug is if you want to learn more about some of the people I've told you about and thousands of people around the world, you can perhaps read a copy of my book called The Legacy of Anne Frank, which was published in 2018. The US publishers are Casemate, and you can also purchase a copy from Amazon. And if you want to get in touch with the Anne Frank Centre for Mutual Respect, their website's very easy. And I give lots of lectures about Anne Frank, her life and legacy, all over the world, all over the English-speaking world. And if you know anybody that would like to hear a lecture, please get in touch, gillianp.com, very easy. So thank you to all the wonderful team at Viking. I love working with Viking. I have to tell you, I tell everyone it's my favourite cruise line, and I'm not lying. It really is. Their people are wonderful, their ships are wonderful, their destinations are wonderful. It's a joy to be on a Viking ship. It's like travelling around the world with wonderful people in a 6-star hotel. It's absolutely stunning. So I'm open for questions now. So the first question is from Cynthia. And she writes, did the Franks have a chance to leave Amsterdam before they went into hiding? Well, no. As I mentioned, Otto Frank really tried to get his family out of Europe. But unfortunately, the doors were closed. And so by 1940, I mean, the German invasion was a complete surprise in 1940. So they really didn't have a chance to do anything. The doors were closed. And interesting what you say about Switzerland. Yes, they did have family in Switzerland, but it was incredibly difficult to get across that Swiss border. It was actually the Swiss who first brought the J stamp as an identity onto identity cards, and the Swiss border was incredibly tightly guarded. It was very difficult to get into Switzerland. It was one of the most difficult countries in the world because all around Europe was being occupied by the Germans. So the Swiss made it very difficult for people to flee because they knew if they opened those borders there would be a floodgate. So that very interesting question. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Dick and Julie, for your lovely words. I'm just going to see if I can find questions. Thank you, everybody, for your... Yes, Barbara, yes, Tuschinski did die in Auschwitz. I beg your pardon, I didn't mean to mention that. Yes, he was deported and sent to Auschwitz. I thought I'd mentioned it, but maybe I'd missed it. Video diaries, they are on YouTube, yes. Let's just see. They are on YouTube, video diaries. Will they be available in the US at some point? Wilma, I don't know. The best thing is to speak to the Anne Frank Centre in New York. That's annefrank.com. And Scott, thank you, Scott, says, don't worry about getting your own tickets. Viking has wonderful staff that will make you feel comfortable in getting to the house. Okay, well, that's lovely to know. Thank you. That's another reason you should always travel with Viking. Thank you for all your lovely comments. Someone visited, Janine, you visited the Anne Frank house in the spring of 65. Wow, it's only just opened. And I bet, well, I know that the very earliest visitors when the Anne Frank house opened, they used to have to, believe it or not, ring the doorbell to get someone would come and open the door for them. So even as 1965, only 5 years later, it must have been an incredible experience to go around the house with probably very few people. Yes, Cynthia, I've answered that. Bill, yes, that's interesting. Will the Dutch ever make Anne Frank a Dutch citizen? As far as I know, Bill, no, because in 1941, the Frank family, their German citizenship was revoked. Remember, the Netherlands was under Nazi occupation then. And then, of course, Anne died before the end of the war, and the Dutch government had a policy that they would not give citizenship posthumously to someone who was no longer alive. So that answers your question. And I know many people have sort of petitioned the Dutch government to make Anne and the Frank family Dutch citizens, but because of the constitution, because of their laws, it won't actually ever happen. But as far as the Dutch are concerned, she's Dutch. The diary was written in Dutch. She had all her schooling in Dutch. She was a Dutch speaker. She was a Dutch girl, and she will always be claimed by the Netherlands. Well, Barbara from Chicago, my favorite city, because my son and his family used to live in Chicago, so I spent a lot of time in Chicago. Oh, lovely! You're on the Rhineland getaway in April next year. How lovely! Yes, to get tickets to the museum, if Viking can't help you and ask in advance, then you must go online to the Anne Frank house. I think it's annefrank.org or annefrank.nl for Netherlands, and see what the ticket availability is. Do it around 6 weeks before you're due to be there. How did the personal photographs of Anne and her family survive the war, Sharon? Well, I did mention this very early on. Otto Frank sent a shipment of a big case of the photographs to his family in Switzerland before they went into hiding. So that's how they survived. And a very unusually large amount of beautiful photographs, because that's how we feel we know Anne Frank, because we read her words and she comes to life as a person, but of course we also see these incredible photographs that Otto took of his two girls. And so after the war, Otto went and got them back from his family in Switzerland. And of course they feed all the exhibitions, the travelling exhibitions, and anything that you see, the displays in the Anne Frank house as well, and any books that are published about Anne. In 1933, well, he couldn't get out of Europe, Catherine. The doors were very firmly closed in the 1930s, once the Nazis had got into power. Particularly America, they really were very, very wary of a huge influx of Jews from all around Europe. So it was very, very difficult. There was recently an exhibition at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, about the Jews, including Otto Frank, trying to get into the United States in the 1930s, and it was virtually impossible. Moving down. Yes, Jean, you've asked me. Oh, I see now. You've posted the question quite early at 7:03, before I got on to the issue of the other families in hiding with the Frank family. So yes, Shelley Winters actually played the role of Augusta Van Pels in hiding, and in the diary, Anne referred to her as Petronella Van Dam. I've got Mika from Montclair. I think that might be Montclair, New Jersey. I know that. Please tell our listeners, well, not friendly war being occupied by nasty Germans who knocked on your house, no gas, no coal. I went through the war. Mika, you're Dutch. And at tulip bulbs fried in candle wax. That's most interesting, actually. Mika, that's most interesting, your comments. I would suggest you get in touch with the Anne Frank Centre in New York. They would love to hear your testimony. And you say you knew Mr. Frank. Oh my goodness. Mika is saying that she knew Otto Frank. She worked for the American Express office in Amsterdam after the war, and he was her client travelling to visit his mother in Switzerland. Mika, please get in touch either to me via my website, gillianp.com, or to annefrank.com the Anne Frank Centre, we would be really would love to hear your testimony. It's fabulous, all about you, the privations of the Dutch during the end, towards the end of the war, eating tulip bulbs. Absolutely incredible. You tulip bulbs fried in candle wax. We'd love to know more about that. Fascinating. And then we've got Kim. Oh, Kim, Kim says that whenever she's in Amsterdam, she goes to the Westerkerk to hear the bells ring. She closes her eyes and thinks about Anne in the attic of that small apartment, listening to the bells, realizing there is life still going on outside, and thinking about the peace that the bells brought to her. Kim, you've written that absolutely beautifully. Thank you for that. Michael, you'll be in Amsterdam in August. Will the Anne Frank House still be open by then? I believe it will. Just keep looking online, because they closures and reopenings, and then obviously social distancing. But please just keep an eye every month. Just pop onto the Anne Frank House website and see what the situation is. Okay, so Mary, I think I answered your question about how to buy tickets for the Anne Frank House. Gail from Minneapolis, a very interesting question, because I'm asked it a lot. Did they ever find out who betrayed them? Well, there have been many, many theories over the years. And in fact, there's actually a chapter in my book called Who Betrayed the Frank Family. Many theories, many books about it, different people. There is one theory that I do think holds more weight than others. It carries more weight, it's more likely. You will read about that if you read the book. There's also, there was a retired FBI officer who was working with a Dutch documentary maker a couple of years ago, using the most up-to-date technology to try and find out who could have betrayed the Frank family. And the documentary is supposed to be, it was supposed to be shown last year, but obviously things got delayed. I think the documentary should be shown either this year or perhaps next year. Look, whatever the documentary throws up, it's actually too late for anything to be confirmed and verified, because all the people that would have those answers are long dead. So I think the only thing, no matter what the theories are, no matter which theories hold more weight than others, the only thing we do know is that we will never know for sure. I also see a comment and question from my colleague, Sharon Douglas, the CEO of the Anne Frank Centre for Mutual Respect. Anne Frank is such an ever-present icon in the city of Amsterdam, that's for sure, Sharon. How do you perceive the spirit of Anne Frank and her diary being used as an educational resource moving forward into the future? I think I touched upon it, and Sharon knows that I'm a great missionary for the power of peer education with this story, because I've seen it in action around the world, whether it's in the townships, impoverished townships of South Africa, the impoverished communities of Brazil, street kids and gangs in Central America, to children in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. The power of children being the educators about Anne Frank and educating others, particularly in areas of great social deprivation where there's very little aspiration and hope for the future. Being appointed an Anne Frank peer educator gives young people a real sense of achievement and aspiration, that if they can do that, they can go on to do anything. So if you're interested in peer education programs or other Anne Frank performances and programs, educational programs coming to your kids, your grandkids, your friends, children's schools, not just around the USA, but in Canada and all around the world, please contact the Anne Frank Centre, annefrank.com, in America, or the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, or indeed the Anne Frank Trust in the UK, annefrank.org.uk, and let them know that you would be very interested in some kind of peer educational program for young people, because it really, really does do incredible things. David is talking about visiting Amsterdam. Arnie is very profound. With the ever increasing deaths of Holocaust survivors, there is increasing evidence that the young people of our world are less informed and increasingly less aware there was a Holocaust. That's a very good point, Arnie. My question is, what about Anne Frank's story? What is it about Anne's story that resonates so profoundly throughout the world? Clearly, there are multiplicity of Holocaust films yearly, yet her story remains a constant beacon of information and humanity. Well, as you say very, very eloquently, it's very difficult to comprehend the loss of millions of people and what that really means in terms of loss to the world. But when you focus on the story of one girl, one family, and what was lost, and all the might have beens, not only with Anne, but actually her older sister, Margot, was an immensely talented, broadly talented teenager. Even just the loss of Margot Frank, it really brings home the dangers of prejudice, the dangers of discrimination, the dangers of being brainwashed, and I guess also that the story is one of redemption. The fact that people risk their lives as rescuers to look after those people in hiding, the moral dilemmas they must have gone through, but the moral courage that they showed. There are so many aspects to the story, but also the great redemption of what Anne's father, Otto Frank, chose to do with her story after the war by promoting her diary as a force for good, and by opening the Anne Frank House as an educational organisation. The very fact that I'm sitting here speaking to you today is because of the inspiration of that man's vision, of a man who came out barely alive from Auschwitz, but was still determined that there is so much power in the education of the next generation. It's an inspiration. A lady called Leslie from Richmond, I don't know if that's Richmond, Virginia, says her maiden name is Frank, and she looked like a child, very much like Anne, and her grandfather's family came to the USA from the Netherlands. How do I go about finding if we are related? Well, remember that the Frank family originated from Germany, from Frankfurt. Yes, you could get in touch with someone at the Anne Frank House if you drop an email over to the Anne Frank House, perhaps just info@annefrank.org or annefrank.nl, and explain that situation. You'd like to do some research, or it might be that there's another institution in Amsterdam, for example, the Jewish Historical Museum might be able to help you there as well. Leroy asks, does she have any living relatives? Well, her cousin, Bernd Elias, who lived in Basel in Switzerland, who was one of the founders of the Anne Frank Foundation in Switzerland, was a very dear friend of mine. It was him I mentioned to you earlier that had put up the gravestone in Bergen-Belsen for Anne and Margot. Sadly, he died a few years ago, and he was really her last living blood relative. In terms of Otto Frank's siblings, Buddy was the son of Otto's sister. Neither of his brothers had children. And interestingly, Edith Frank, her two brothers, Walter and Julius, they emigrated to America and lived in Massachusetts immediately after Kristallnacht. They were imprisoned, but then they were allowed out. And neither of them had descendants. So that whole sort of line of Edith Frank and Otto Frank was really sort of destroyed and cut off. Anne does have step relatives. Now, if you recall that Otto remarried in 1953 to an Auschwitz survivor called Fritzi Geringer, who lost her husband and son in the camps. And Fritzi had a daughter called Eva. And Eva is one of my co-founders of the Anne Frank Trust in the UK, very close friend. And she describes herself as Anne Frank's posthumous stepsister, because she is in fact the daughter, she's the stepdaughter. Eva is the stepdaughter of Otto Frank, and she adored Otto Frank, and Otto Frank became a father to her after the war and a loving grandfather to her own 3 daughters. But in terms of blood relatives, there is no one. Doreen asks, when I arrive for my Grand European River Cruise, oh, sounds lovely, I'll only have a part of the day for sightseeing. Yes, when you say, is it possible to visit Anne Frank's home, I assume you mean the Anne Frank house with limited time. Yes, because you'll have booked your ticket online, you will have a timed ticket according to your schedule, and it will take you probably about an hour to go around the house. And in terms of how long from the cruise port to the museum, not long at all. From the cruise port, you can actually walk along to the central station along the port, and you can get a tram, or you can get a taxi, or you can probably even get a taxi from the cruise port. Why will not the Dutch government make Anne at last a Dutch citizen? I think I touched on this, that of course the Dutch have a policy of not making people Dutch citizens posthumously, and because she had died in the Holocaust, she wasn't able to be a Dutch citizen. Was it ever documented where Anne Frank was ever taken and how and when she died? Yes, she died in Bergen-Belsen from starvation, malnourishment and typhus, the deadly disease. And finally, from Carol, Anne's family in the Van Dans, the Van Pels, were on the last transport out of the transit camp Westerbork to Auschwitz. The transports were stopped in September 1944 because in Auschwitz, by that time, the Allies were advancing, and of course the Russians were advancing from the east as well, and they wanted really to blow up the gas chambers. So they started blowing up the gas chambers to hide the evidence of their brutality. So that's basically why that was the last transport on September the 3rd out of the Netherlands. So I think we've pretty much finished the questions. I'd just better go up to the top. Oh, I think there are a few more. Yes, a few more have come in as I've been talking. Mary from Citrus Heights. Yes, what happened to the people who hid the family? Yes, I'm often asked this, and today I just really didn't have time to tell you. There were 4 main helpers. Miepjes, who found the diary, and she was let go because the arresting officer, the Gestapo officer, was from Vienna. And Miep was originally from Vienna, and he recognized her accent. And although he berated her for hiding Jews, a terrible crime, he did actually let her go. Bep, the secretary, she was young, she was a teenager. She got very frightened when she saw the police and the Gestapo man arriving. And she actually fled. Now, the 2 trusted managers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, they were both arrested. Johannes Kleiman was actually freed from the prison hospital by the Red Cross, who went to visit him. And they said that he was in not a fit state, and Victor Kugler actually escaped. He escaped the transport. There were some very nice comments. Lynette asked, are all the addresses you mentioned in this presentation listed in your book? Lynette, no, I don't think I have listed them in my book, all those, because this is a very destination Amsterdam focused lecture. But if you Google those particular places, sites of interest around the Moveda Plain, then you will find this, or you can actually just Google sites of interest in Amsterdam connected to Anne Frank, and you'll probably get the addresses. If not, you can ask the Anne Frank house. And I think that's it. I think I've been through all the questions. And thank you so much. You've been a fantastic audience, and not too noisy either, really quiet and attentive. I'm very pleased with that. So hopefully one day I'll see you on a beautiful Viking cruise. I cannot commend Viking enough. They are absolutely wonderful. You are stepping into a lovely environment, beautiful environment when you step on board those ships and riverboats. So hopefully our paths will cross in the near future. Thank you very much for listening.